The serpent is an interesting figure, and as we have dug into this subject, this entity that the serpent is, we've really come to understand that what the serpent represents is a messenger bearing a specific light that is a darkness to the garden. That serpent is a messenger of light, or should I say in the terms that we are now growing more familiar with, the serpent actually being a recurring Balaam, a recurring son of man, a recurring priest, a recurring false prophet through ecclesiastical history. This individual is not a phenomenal individual. This is not an extraterrestrial figure. This is not any sort of whatever we want to imagine. Bible is concrete. Bible is sure on what it is grounding itself in illustration. And in illustration, this serpent figure is a role fulfilled by a Balaam, or by a false prophet, or by a false priest, or by a false member of a priesthood. Now, this individual is entering into the chosen garden with a specific and a peculiar light that garden is growing unaccustomed to, or is supposed to grow out of and away from. This individual agent is hired to overthrow the garden by placing into it the philosophy that it is supposed to grow up out of. That is the light that this figure has. And what's interesting is that the light bearer has a specific term. The light bearer has a specific term. Looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 15. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 15 reads, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works." Now, the author writing Corinthians is letting us know how to tell the Satan. Now, in this context of which we are reading, Satan is not a person that is mythological. Satan is not a person that is an invisible entity that is hating human beings. Satan is not this kind of deity figure, evil, and as we would imagine, however we would imagine such a figure to be, according to whatever tradition we are entertaining religiously, spiritually, in context of what the Bible is giving to us. The serpent is a minister of light. The minister of light is called Satan. Called Satan because the light that he is giving is mischievous, is deceptive, and has really everything to do with what is against the host of which that light is being shed on. That light shed on that host, it is actually against that host, but is to dupe that host to believe that light is for it. Now, the serpent fulfilling such a role, Balaam, I should say, the Balaam of the garden fulfilling such a role, is actually fulfilling the role of a Satan. And of course, I've gone through different definitions of Satan before, where Satan is understood from the book of Numbers as being an agent that is withstanding against. And so what we have in the garden is a figure, a false priest, a false prophet, withstanding against the host of the garden and withstanding against the philosophy of that garden, and doing so by bringing into play, by bringing into the scene a contrary philosophy than what that garden is all about. And this contrary philosophy, this ideal that is presented to the host of the garden, this is to get them into understanding the image of God for which they are to grow up out of subtly in ways that they are not familiar with, that they're not accustomed to, that they would never suspect would lead them back down into the path of slavery for which the mind of that garden has led them up out of. The author writing to the Corinthians, is letting their audience know that Whatever minister is manifesting the mind of Satan, you will know them according to whatever works they are putting forth. You will know them according to whatever works that they are putting forth. And the kind of works that they are putting forth are works of machination. Machination, as we saw, individuals crept in unawares, turning whatever grace there is into lasciviousness, doing so subtly. And we would never know it because, as I said in episodes prior, when you have someone approaching you saying, I am a servant of God, I am a this of God, I am a that of God, God says this, has God said that? What has God said? When you have an individual throwing this term around God, and you're in a landscape, and you're in a setting where you are understanding that God is the one that's there, what you're hearing, it's not going to be what the speaker is intending. The speaker entering into that garden, as Balaam understands what they're doing, what they need to do. They are there to turn the minds of the members of that garden to understand the benefit and the relevance of the image of God. If you can be created in the image of God, because the ones in the garden were not created in the image of God. They were not. The image of God is an image that one is resting within via brightness, via praise, via glory. The image of God is not something that you can be molded into physically. This is something that you can be molded into conceptually. And we've gone and seen the illustrations of what the image of God is. The image of God being understood by how God in Genesis chapter 1 is defining himself as creator, as speaking, and as what is spoken is being done. Well, what is being transmitted to the one observing is that I must also speak, and what I speak must also be done, and for good, as God did it for good. This is the image of God, and the image of God manifested in mankind, or in kind of man, which Bible breaks down as priest kind, or as priesthood. That kind of image that should be taken from such an illustration is an image that I must write, and what I must write, one must do, and when one must do, one must be seen as righteous when doing, when observing, when just there in the moment, and being in the moment enraptured with the feeling of what is done, so that there can be a certainty of conscience, and so that beyond certainty of conscience, it can influence action, and influencing action, and it can influence feeling, and influence feeling. It can bring a certain sort of peace and a cultivation of oneness with whatever deity that is imagined, or with whatever divine eye one imagines to be amazed or drawn to such an act. And so this is what the figure, serpent, wants to bring into the garden. This does not exist in the garden at all. Everything that I just said is in representing the image of God from Genesis 1. It's not. It's not in the garden. What is in the garden is a stream of thought concerning regeneration from dust and maintaining a cyclical experience in regenerating. The idea of eternal life. Remember, it wasn't just knowledge of good and evil that was there, it was also life. The idea of eternal life, and this is all figurative language and illustration, eternal being a term of its own, life being a term of its own. Having the mind continually revive itself to embrace a sort of newness that deviates from the type of experience that one would find in Genesis chapter 1. When you have the image of God brought in, when you have an experience where the conversation is dictated to for how it should be, when you have an experience where the conversation is knowing its outcome and doing for outcome, well, you don't really have the time or the space for growth and for development, not just devotionally or spiritually, but also as a human being. Serpent wants to stop that. and to stop that and to put in place the kind of development that it sees is more valuable according to the routine found in Genesis chapter 1.
Knowing Bible is a course for learners wanting to grow closer to themselves and to their Creator. There is a reason why we trust the Bible. There is a reason why the Bible moves us to celebrate it. There is also a reason why we feel hesitant to let the Bible's words satisfy us. Traditional religious theory isn't always satisfactory. Carrying a belief without proof will soon aggravate our thoughts and feelings. Knowing Bible is a course that is designed to wake us up to who and what our belief is. Knowing Bible is for learners that want a living experience beyond conventional religion. Don't let this educational opportunity slip away from you.
Now that Balaam that the author of the book of Genesis notes as a serpent, and which traces down to Satan, is a messenger or is a bearer of light. And as a bearer or as a messenger of light, again, Bible articulates this. The author writing to the Corinthians articulates this as being termed as a Satan. And not in the traditional sense as we may think, or as we may, according to whatever perception or denominated understanding we have, link. This is a messenger of light. And just get a brief breakdown here. When we think light, what are we supposed to think of? When we think light, what are we supposed to think of? Just looking at Psalm 43 and verse 3. Psalm 43 and verse 3 reads, O send out thy light and thy truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me unto thy holy hill and to thy tabernacle. So when we're seeing this term light, when we're seeing this term associated with that messenger of that Satan is a light bringer. Well, the light bringer is one that is bringing truth. As we see in this verse, the two connected. Again, Psalm 43 and verse 3, O send out thy light and thy truth. Bible here, the psalmist here is connecting light and truth as one. What is truth? This individual, we can say, is bearing light, yes, but now in a new context, he's bearing truth. Well, what is truth? Proverbs 12 and verse 17. Proverbs 12 and verse 17, he that speaketh truth showeth forth righteousness, but a false witness deceit. So when we're hearing truth, linked to truth, according to the Bible, or with the Bible's use, is righteousness. So this individual is a light bearer. This individual is a truth bearer. This individual is a bearer of righteousness. And what kind of righteousness or what kind of truth? Episodes prior, I highlighted that from the book of Romans, where there is a sense of truth that is from within the law. That Balaam figure, that figure entering into the garden, is a bearer of the knowledge and of the truth that is to exist, or that is to believe to be existing within the religious law. Looking at Isaiah 51 and verse 7, he's a bearer of righteousness then. But what does this mean? Isaiah 51 and verse 7, hearken unto me, you that know righteousness, the people in whose heart is my law. So connected to righteousness, the Bible likes to do these associations to repeat and enlarge definitions, to repeat and to enlarge to its student how to further define certain things. When we're hearing light bearer, we're hearing truth bearer. When we're hearing truth bearer, we're hearing righteousness bearer. When we're hearing righteousness bearer, we're actually hearing law bearer. Looking at Psalm 119, 142. Psalm 119, 142, thy righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and thy law is the truth. So we don't really have to guess with this one. What is connected to truth? What is connected to righteousness? It is law. To bear righteousness, in a sense, means to bear law. And again, going back to what the author of the book of Romans in that chapter highlights as what that kind of righteousness is, what that kind of truth is. It is a knowledge as is found in the religious law. You go back and look at the sequences of what is taking place between that serpent figure and that woman figure. We are seeing just that. The serpent manipulating that woman's mind by placing into context an instrument to be taken for righteousness. That by taking that instrument and using that instrument for righteousness, they may attain to something more. And then all of a sudden, what was accursed now became good for food. What was accursed now became fit for wisdom. What was accursed became right to consume. And it became right to consume. It became right to taste. It became right to see as wisdom. Because when you're placing the image of God into that context, when you are looking at that tree from the philosophy of the religious law, nothing is off. There's nothing cut off from there. Everything goes. But what they found out, what the reader finds out, is that's not the right code for the devotional conversation to live by. The figure ultimately bearing light, ultimately bearing truth, ultimately bearing righteousness, is ultimately bearing law. The light bringer is the law bringer. The light bringer is the law bringer. And this is why the author, writing to the Corinthians, allows them to know that they will know that Satan according, or should I say they will know that false apostle, those false prophets, according to their works, because their works always end in law. Their works always end in religious law. And it will be subtle. This was Paul's number one issue. Paul entered into the garden, right? There was a garden that existed before Paul got there. This individual garden, we may fitly say, was understood to be the way. In this particular garden, there was no belief about a deified man. In this particular garden, there was no belief about a deified man standing at the right hand of God. In this particular garden, there was no belief about the blood of a man being divine and needing to be fixed on and needing to be consumed and all of this other stuff that Paul brings in. In the garden that then existed prior to Paul, none of what Paul taught existed. None of it existed. But then Paul entered into the fray. And the character Paul entered into the fray and took that way to a place that it never intended to go. Paul took that garden and the philosophy therein and subtly manipulated it. And subtly manipulating that philosophy, well, where is that philosophy today? Can we even recount it clearly within the Bible or through any other sort of documents? There's a lot of piecing together that we have to do to get there. But what we have, is the remembrances of a particular individual entered into a particular garden with machinations that were contrary to the foundational philosophy of that garden, subtly introducing into that garden new law, and introducing that garden to new law, abandoning the old. The new law that I bring, said this character, Paul, can do more for you than anything that the law of Moses could have ever done. The new law that I bring to you, because your law always abounds with you, yet in sin, and even once a year, your religion testifies to it on the Day of Atonement. Yet my law brings to you an act that you do not have to necessarily do, but must ultimately by conscience fully believe on and live therein, and to solidify your living therein by a sort of lifestyle to declare the confidence that you have. Not a lifestyle by rituals, not a lifestyle by deeds, but a lifestyle of suffering. This is the kind of philosophy that Paul character brought into that then garden and flipped it upside down and inside out, and by doing so added into that garden's philosophy machinations from pagan cults from outside of that garden and even from outside of the realm of the land that they were in. Author of the book of Genesis is warning their reader of such characters, because such characters will manifest, they will recur in ecclesiastical history, whether past tense, whether in the future, they will be there. And the author of the book of Genesis is writing in ways to let the individual know when Satan has arrived, when Serpent has arrived, when Balaam is here.
We are to have, as is said and believed when it comes to life and religion, faith. But when it comes to exercising faith, a very crucial aspect of having and exercising faith isn't mentioned. In order to have faith in anything, we need to know what we would have faith in. This book looks into how the Bible defines the process of justification. We are supposed to know what we believe. Personal knowledge will bring life to our experience with the Bible. Get justification to know how to safely take care of your faith.
In right context of language, Satan is no phenomenal figure. Satan is no invisible entity. According to Bible, and that's my main concern, according to Bible, Satan is a false prophet of the image of God. Or should I say in plainer terms, a Satan is a priest bearing a message of knowledge confined to a particular garden, rehearsing to themselves in an interesting way and in a subtle manner the philosophy of the religious law. When we think about how we define things traditionally, and then when we think about how the Bible defines things, I'm always saying that when you enter into the Bible, you really have to let go of what you believe, because what you believe doesn't really matter. What I believe when I enter into the Bible does not really matter. What matters is what is unwritten from what is written. And in order to understand that, there is a process of separating from self and a process of allowing the devotional conversations, thoughts, and feelings to meditate on what it must, in order for it to weigh with what it thinks it knows, wisdom that it is gaining, and for allowing the two to come together for a continual process of growth and of development and understanding. When we're seeing that serpent figure, we're seeing a Balaam figure. This is a false prophet. This is not any sort of angel. This is not any sort of light-bearing minister. This isn't any sort of positive role model priest. This isn't any sort of light-bearing esoteric, wherever we want to go. That's not where the Bible goes. Bible goes very and quite plainly. Bible goes to false prophet. There's no magician involved in this. There is no extraterrestrial phenomenon involved with this. This is a false prophet bringing to a chosen garden the philosophy of the religious law, manipulated to overthrow that garden, to turn it backwards. It does not want that garden to move forward, because this prophet, although false to the garden and to the mind therein, This is a true minister to God. Not the God of the garden, not the mind of the garden, not for the host of the garden, but for Eden, for Genesis chapter 1's main creating figure. And that is very confusing. And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be confusing because the figure presenting themselves in the name of that garden, they are taking on a role as being the savior for the mind of that garden because they are appearing in familiar garments. They are appearing in with familiar words. They're appearing with a familiar aura about them that host can resonate with. But what that host does not know is that they are a minister of light. And yes, that host will acknowledge them as such. But that host does not realize that the light that they are a minister for is actually a truth, that is a law that traces back to the image of a God that garden has been set up to get away from. All and all, through and through. So we're seeing that serpent categorized in the role of that Balaam, and then we're seeing that serpent, while fulfilling that role, also fulfilling that role of that Satan. Author writing the book of Genesis wants us to understand that the terms that they are familiar with, they are terms that we aren't familiar with. We have to get accustomed to Bible terms in order to fully grasp the lesson they're in. And once we do grasp that lesson, well, as I said in episodes prior, justification is about allowing the conversation to move on and to grow up from former unhealthy thoughts and feelings. And when realizing that the bearer of light is actually an unhealthy minister, the journey begins.